Hey, what's going on? In this video, I'm going to be making a 114 layer ladder Damascus chef knife. This knife is for an artist I found on TikTok named Will Eskridge. You can find a link to his YouTube channel and TikTok profile in the video description. Will has a unique and quirky style that I really liked, so I reached out to him to see if he'd be interested in doing a custom painting of my dog Drake in exchange for a Damascus chef knife. Here's a little peek at the painting he made for me, and also my dog Drake, who passed away last year. I had him for 17 years, and he traveled all over the world with me. He lived a long and happy life, and I'm going to miss him a lot. Now back to the build. I've stacked up alternating layers of 1084 and 15 and 20 steel, and I started out with 19 layers in my first stack. I like to soak my billets in WD-40 before putting them in the forge. This helps prevent oxygen from getting in between the layers and allowing scale to form. I get asked about my press all the time. It's a 12-ton hydraulic press from Cole Iron Works. It's pretty awesome, but my only regret is not getting a bigger press. Maybe one of these days I'll jump up to a 16 or a 25-ton press. I would have normally drawn the billet out a lot longer before cutting it, but it was basically just getting too long for my forge. I started with way more steel than I needed because I planned on using the rest of the Damascus for other builds, but I didn't really think through how long the billet was going to get when I drew it out. So I just cut the billet in two and continued along with half the steel I started with. I only wanted to do one more stack, so after drawing out the billet I cut it into 6 pieces, and that got me to my final layer count of 114 layers. I cleaned up all of these pieces of steel like normal, ground flat, cleaned with acetone, welded them together, soaked them in WD-40, and then into the forge. Here I'm pressing in valleys, and then I'll grind away the majority of the ridges to create the ladder pattern in the steel. One of the downsides to Damascus patterns is the amount of waste you get. A lot of the time you're grinding away a huge portion of the Damascus steel you started with. Now that I've got the billet drawn out, I'll clean it up and do a little test etch to see what the pattern looks like. I still had more steel than I needed, so I cut off a chunk and labeled it to use in another build. I can start to forge the blade to shape. I don't want to do too much hammering because the more I forge, the more I'll distort the pattern. A lot of people don't like to do any forging on a Damascus blade to protect the pattern that they created, and some people think it's not really a knife if you don't forge it. I suppose I'm somewhere in the middle, not because I think forging is better than stock removal, it's just that I like to forge, and I think the distortions in the pattern make the blades more unique and kind of cool in their own right. Here I'm using the press to hold the knife while I align the blade to the tang how I want. I cut in most of the tip, but now I'm just going to refine the shape on the anvil. Now I'm hammering in the bevels on both sides. I'm using a rounded off railroad spike here to work the choil where the ricasso transitions into the blade. Lastly, we'll get it nice and straight. I'm going to clean up the profile on the grinder and take it up to a 120 grit finish around the edges. The idea here is that this will reduce any potential cracks during heat treat due to deep scratches caused by coarse belts like a 36 grit belt. For heat treat, I run 3 normalization cycles at 1650, 1500, and 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. I quench the blade at 1475 in Parks 50 quench oil that's heated to around 100 degrees. I temper the blade for 2 2-hour cycles at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a portable Rockwell hardness tester. There's a little bit of a learning curve to getting accurate and consistent results, but once you figure out what you're doing, it seems to work well. I find that taking a finish up to at least 120 grit makes a big difference, and you have to take your measurements on a completely flat surface. If you take a reading on the bevel, it will affect your results. If you're curious, you can find a link to this item and a lot of the other tools and materials that I use in my videos on my website, davidmoonforge.com, under the product links tab. I gave you a little sneak peek at the pattern in the steel before I started hand sanding. I take this finish up to 600 grit before the first etch cycle. Here I'm etching in my maker's mark with the Personalizer Plus. This is a pretty simple system to make on your own with like a motorcycle battery or car battery, something DC. And there's lots of tutorials out there, but I really like the ease of just buying this thing. I like to run 3 etch cycles in ferric chloride acid for 5 minutes each, and between each cycle I sand off the oxides with increasingly higher grit sandpaper. I use 1200 grit, 1500 grit, and 2000 grit. This aquarium bubbler is a really nice trick to help you get an even etch across your blade. If you ever have problems with lines or streaks, this will make a big difference. One of the common things I would run into is streaks coming from my handle pin holes or from my hot stamp maker's mark. The bubbler has completely fixed that for me. Now that I've got the blade etched, I'm going to work on making a handle. I wanted to do something a little quirky for Will, and since he oftentimes puts animals in his paintings, I figured I'd cast a small skunk figurine in epoxy along with this maple burl. I used some transparent dye to add a little color, and the idea was that I'd have a little bit of a gradient going from darker to lighter from the bottom to the top, but it didn't really work out. It all just kind of mixed together and you couldn't really tell a difference, or at least I could. I used a combination of an oscillating multi-tool and a torch to get as many of the air bubbles out of the epoxy as I could. Everything's set up just fine, and for a hot second I thought this was actually going to work out great. I sketched out lines to shape the handle, and at this point I was a little bit skeptical. I could see that I was going to have to make the handle bigger than I normally would so that I didn't grind into the skunk, but I kind of just kept telling myself, well, it'll be fine once I remove a little more material. I got the handle fitted nicely with the tang and got it epoxied up. I really wish that I could have listened to my intuition as soon as I thought this wasn't going to work. Anyway, I kept plodding along, grinding to all of my lines, waiting for the handle to start to feel like it should. I don't know how well you can tell in the video, but this thing is absolutely massive. It's way too big, it's way too heavy, and it doesn't work with this blade profile at all. But I just kept telling myself it would be okay and kept wasting time and energy trying to polish a turd. I got it finished up, and there were a ton of bubbles still in the epoxy. The super glue that I used to get the skunk to stick to the maple started yellowing. The handle felt like hot garbage in the hand. Best of intentions, but this thing was doomed from the start. I finally gave in and admitted defeat. This is a block of olive wood with some red transparent epoxy. I figured this would look nice, but I have to admit that I'm pretty bummed about the vision for this knife and the way it turned out. I also had this idea to make a bolster out of walnut and then carve out some areas to fill with epoxy so it would look like frosting on a donut, and I'd also drill some holes and fill them to look like sprinkles. I did some test pieces of that and it just didn't turn out like what I wanted it to. I guess some builds just go that way. So I'll go through all the same processes for fitting up another handle, and I added a black G10 spacer just to break it up a little. I got a nice seamless fit between the ricasso and the bolster. I don't know that I've ever made a knife handle with transparent materials like this so you can see part of the tang inside. I actually think it looks kind of cool. It's like one of those toys with a transparent case so you can see all the inner workings. I took this handle up to a 600 grit finish, polished it up on a buffing wheel, and applied 3 coats of Odie's oil finish. I used diamond stones to sharpen the blade, and I progressed through a 300 grit, 1200 grit, and 3000 grit stone. I finished it off on a leather strap loaded with 5 micron and 3.5 micron diamond compound. I apply a food-safe blade wax that I make from mineral oil and beeswax to protect the steel while the blade's in storage and in transit. This isn't required, but it certainly helps get the Damascus pattern to pop. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the build.